Hello everyone, my name is Elliot Yu. I'm co-founder and publisher of Energy and Income Advisor as well as Free Market Speculator. About a month ago on July 6th, I sent out a video and I posted it on Substack, I posted it on YouTube, I even posted clips of it over on Twitter, X, and it was titled, "Energy, is China beating the United States, beating the US?" It was about a half-hour long video. And I did receive quite a lot of pushback about it. And what I was really talking about was the idea out there in the mainstream media that's constantly repeated basically, that China is beating the US because it is expanding solar electricity generation capacity far faster than the US or in fact any other country around the world. It accounts for most of the solar capacity in the world is in China. It's growing very rapidly, no doubt about that. But the main pushback I received, or at least the main substantive pushback I received, was over the idea that China isn't really seeing an energy transition. Now, you've probably heard the term energy transition or green transition, countless times over the last few years. And the idea, basically, is that all over the world, we have renewable energy sources, particularly solar and wind, that are supplanting or replacing traditional fossil fuel energy sources like coal, natural gas for power generation, oil more broadly. And in my view, that isn't really happening globally, and specifically not in China. We're not really seeing an energy transition. We're seeing what I would characterize as more of an energy augmentation. And I want to talk a little bit, I want to address some of the replies and pushback I received on that last video. I'll link to that video here below this video in case you haven't seen it or want to go back and listen to it. I'm going to try to keep this video a little shorter though. But specifically, I'm going to address some of those concerns in this video today and explain what I mean by an energy augmentation rather than an energy transition. So first up, here's the chart you've probably seen countless times in the news, or some version of this chart. This is actually from the Energy Institute's Statistical Review of World Energy, and it shows total Chinese solar energy consumption in exajoules since 2011. Now, why did I pick 2011? I picked 2011 because before 2011, China generated essentially zero solar energy. So before that, it would have just been a straight line around zero. And what you can see here is we grew in China from 0 to over 3 exajoules between 2011 and 2024. And indeed, most of that growth has happened since sort of 2017, 2018, 2019. So in the last sort of 5 to 7 years. So we have seen very strong, very rapid growth in Chinese solar power generation. I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that they're building solar energy plants faster than anywhere else around the world. Not at all, because I wouldn't dispute that because it's a fact, okay? However, let's take this chart, some version of which you've probably seen countless times over the last few years, and actually display all the data. So this is China energy consumption across for all uses, whether it's electricity generation or in cars or freight trains or whatever, but in exajoules over the same period. Okay, and I've put most of Chinese energy production, not every source, but the major ones, which includes solar, right, which is that sort of bold red line I've placed on the chart, nuclear, oil, coal, hydroelectric, right, water power. Natural gas, and wind power. And what you can see on this chart is two things, I think. First of all, solar is by far the smallest source of total energy consumption in China in 2024. As I said, it's a little over 3.02 exajoules, which is up from 0 in 2011. But let's put that in the context of coal at 92.16 exajoules. Oil at 32.3 exajoules. Now, oil mainly a transportation fuel, but it's still a lot bigger. It's 10 times the size of solar in terms of energy consumption in China. We can look at hydro at 4.9 exajoules, nuclear power at 4.92 exajoules, so even a little more, and wind even at about 3.6 exajoules are all bigger than solar. Now, the second point to note is not just the sheer scale, but the absolute growth over the last few years. As I said, solar energy generation in China has really taken off over the last sort of 5 to 7 years, but in absolute terms, we've also seen sizable growth in coal energy consumption over the same period. And if we look at it in absolute terms, in 2019, Chinese coal consumption was under 85 exajoules. As I said, now it's over 92, right? So the absolute growth in power generation from coal, sort of 7 or 8 exajoules, is far higher than the absolute growth in solar over the last 5 to 7 years, or in fact, the total amount of solar energy production in China. So it's not really accurate to say that this is an energy transition, because transition implies that you are building up renewable power generation, the use of solar and wind, which China is, as I said, not disputing that. But it also implies that you are reducing your consumption of other sources of energy, particularly coal and nat gas on the electricity side, oil, other fossil fuels, right? So there's a transition implies that those fossil fuel energy sources, in particular coal and nat gas in China's case, are declining while renewable energy or electricity generation is booming. Now, the reality is that half of that's true, right? Half of that theme is true. Renewable energy generation in China is growing very rapidly. It's still small. It's a small base, but it is growing very rapidly, no doubt, faster than anywhere else in the world. But the second part of that's not true. China is not decreasing its coal consumption. It's not decreasing its natural gas consumption. It's not decreasing its nuclear consumption. It's not decreasing its oil consumption. These are all growing over the last 5 to 7 years. They're adding renewables on top of that. But perhaps even more to the point is the fact that China doesn't even call its own energy policy an energy transition. Now, Western media does sometimes refer to China's policies as energy transition or a green transition, but China itself doesn't really do that. Now, the truth is that China does have a word for its energy policy. They don't call it, though, an energy transition or a green transition. That's something that you see a lot in the Western media. You see this talk about the green energy revolution, the green energy transition, the solar revolution, solar transition. But China doesn't frame its own energy policy in its own words in that manner. They do have a word for it, though, and this is it. And that obviously is in Chinese characters, which if you're like me, you probably can't read. Here's the anglicized version. Now, let me apologize in advance. I do not speak Chinese, and so I apologize if I butcher this pronunciation, but it's something like xian li ho po. Xian li ho po. And what it translates into basically is build first, break later. Or sometimes I've seen it translated into build first and destroy later. And the idea is actually pretty simple. And it's reflected on those charts I just showed you of all the different forms of energy in China growing. And it's basically that China wants to grow all forms of energy to meet its near-term economic needs, be able to grow its economy, and to achieve energy security, by which I mean that, obviously if a country becomes too dependent on one form of energy that it has to import, for example, natural gas or oil or coal, whatever it may be, then, their energy supply is not secure. It doesn't take much for that supply to be cut off. A war in a neighboring country, as happened in the Ukraine and affecting Europe's imports of natural gas from Russia, some political issues, some issues with tariff issues, for example, with a country like the United States. These can all affect energy security. And so China wants to ensure that it has adequate energy, low-cost energy to meet its growing economic needs or growing economy. Also achieve energy security, right? So it wants to do that first. So build first, meaning build out all these different sources of energy. So you're seeing, yes, renewable energy grow. You're seeing solar and wind grow. But you're also seeing coal, natural gas, nuclear, and hydro grow as well. And again, the reason for that is this build first, break later theme. The idea being first, you build all these different sources of energy, you get that energy security, you get that reliability, and then once you have a secure new renewable-based energy supply source in place, you can think about reducing your consumption of other sources of energy, whether that be coal or natural gas or oil. So it's different than an energy transition because you're not building renewable energy sources and closing down your existing fossil fuel production. You're building them both at the same time, and then in the future, should you get to a point where you can transition more and actually start closing down that fossil fuel capacity, shifting more to renewables, you can move on and do that. Build first, break later. Xian, Li Ho Po. Okay? Now, I was thinking about that in the context of the broader world and also in the context of the United States. And it strikes me that actually there are countries and states in the United States. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the experience of two states in the United States here in just a minute. And that's going to be the main focus of this video. But we can also talk in future videos. If you're interested, drop me a comment. Tell me about other states you want to hear about their strategy. Tell me about other countries you want to hear about their strategy for this energy transition versus build first, break later, or what I like to call the energy augmentation strategy. But for today, I want to keep this simple, and I want to focus specifically on two states. California, the largest state by population in the United States, and Florida, the third largest state by population in the United States, that also happens to be my home state. So we have two large states in the United States. They both have seen a big population growth since 1990. California's population has grown by about 9.7 million people, but that's only about a third growth, 32 point some percent growth over that time period, because California is a much bigger state population-wise than Florida. Now, Florida's population has grown at a much faster pace, about 81% since 1990, and that is actually 10.5 million new people in Florida. So these are both states that have seen population growth since 1990, and Florida has seen continued population growth over the last 10 years or so. California's has slowed down a lot. But they both are growing in terms of population over the full terms of these charts I'm about to show you. Now, to put that in context, the state of North Carolina has about 11 million people, right? Georgia, I think, is around 11.3 million people. And the state of Michigan is about 10.1 million people. So Florida has added more population than the entire current state of Michigan between 1990 and today, just to put it into context. So let's start with California, because I think California is often held up as a state which is very rapidly growing renewable energy production, solar and some wind, right? And is also a leader in the energy transition here in the United States, the green revolution, if you will. So let me show up that first. I'm going to throw up a chart. This is actually California's total energy generation capacity by energy source. This is net summer generation capacity. These data is all from the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Energy. And I'm stacking these columns so you can see total generation. You kind of see the breakdown of different energy sources. And so you can kind of see what's going on here. If you look at that dark blue portion of the bar on the bottom of each of these bars, that's solar. And so you can see that California didn't produce much solar energy in 2010, but starting in 2012, 2013, it really took off. And so it's grown very rapidly over the ensuing, between 2015 and 2023, which happens to be the last year for which we have data from EIA. You can also see, natural gas is the largest source of electricity generation capacity in the state of California. That's that light blue bar. You can see that, coal is the green portion of the bar. That was historically pretty important for California back in the 90s, but not today. They've shuttered a lot of their coal fire capacity. Nuclear used to be more important than it is today, but they've also shuttered a lot of their nuclear capacity. Coal is almost non-existent in California now. Wind grew very rapidly between 2010 and 2015 or so, and has continued to grow, but of course solar has taken off in absolute size and in growth terms here over the last few years. And to some extent that makes sense. California has good solar generating characteristics, the weather there, for example. So you can see kind of on this chart what's going on, but I want to flip to this next chart to sort of make it more easy to see. So this is California, and I would characterize this as an energy transition model. In other words, it is let's build renewable capacity and at the same time reduce our generation capacity from fossil fuels like natural gas, mainly in California's case, but also other sources of dispatchable energy production or baseload energy production like nuclear, like coal, like hydro, okay? And so what I've done here is the dark blue bars, if you will, are generation capacity of coal, natural gas, hydroelectric, and nuclear combined for the state of California. And those orange bars are solar plus wind, okay? So you can see that California grew both its dispatchable or baseload forms of energy, the dark blue bars, columns, and its renewable capacity from 1990 up until about 2010. But since 2010, the total coal, nat gas, hydro, nuclear combined has declined. The capacity has declined, while of course the solar and wind, as I mentioned, has taken off. So that has slowed a little bit between 2020 and 2023. We've seen a slower rate of decline in coal, nat gas, hydro, and nuclear power capacity as renewables have continued to grow. But generally speaking, since 2010, the coal, nat gas, hydro, nuclear portion of this chart has declined, while solar and wind has taken off. So that is at least somewhat. There are no pure models one way or the other, even in the United States or globally. There are no true pure plays, but California is more of a transition model in the sense that it's reducing capacity of fossil fuel sources and other dispatchable forms of energy like nuclear and hydro while increasing solar and wind. Okay, now let's flip over and look at the same data sets for the state of Florida. Okay, now as I said, Florida's seen faster population growth in absolute terms and obviously in percentage terms since 1990. So overall electricity demand is growing at a faster pace, and it's growing at a faster pace in California, particularly over the last few years. However, you can also see how Florida's electricity generation capacity mix has evolved since 1990. On this chart, much as you could on the last chart. Now, the first thing that jumps out is the rise of natural gas, right? That's that blue portion of the bar there, that light blue portion of the bar. And you can see that, since 1990, that's absolutely exploded. The amount of natural gas generation capacity in the state of Florida has absolutely ballooned. At the same time, you can see that, coal-fired generating capacity has declined immensely over that same time period. It was still important up through 2000, 2005, 2010 even, but since then it is diminished considerably. And at the same time, you can see very rapid growth in particularly solar production since 2015. Really, it started a little later for Florida than it did for California. California was more like 2012 to 2015. Florida was more like 2017 to 2020. But it actually has one of the fastest growth rates for solar energy capacity in this state. It is one of the top solar producing states in the United States. It is, I believe in recent years, actually even faster growing in percentage terms and in megawatt terms than California. So it's seeing very rapid growth in solar energy capacity builds, certainly in percentage terms, relative to most other states in the United States. So like California, it is a leader in solar. However, you can kind of see the difference between the Florida, which I would describe as an energy augmentation model, versus the California energy transition model. In Florida, we have seen growth in renewables on top of growth in gas and other sources of energy production like nuclear is a big one in Florida. Coal, of course, has shrunk, but gas has grown way more than coal has shrunk. So let's look at this on the similar basis to what I showed you for California, where I'm going to put coal, natural gas, and nuclear as a dark blue bar, and solar on its own as a orange bar. Florida does not have significant wind power production, okay? None, really. So you have the dark blue bars are the dispatchable or baseload energy sources, which include coal, natural gas, and nuclear. Florida traditionally also had quite a lot of oil power production, but we don't anymore. And California actually had some in the past as well, but they don't either anymore. But what you can see here is that kind of the opposite to what is happening in California. While you could say that coal, nat gas, and nuclear capacity growth has slowed in recent years, there is a pretty solid uptrend. 2005 to 2010 to 2015 to 2020 to 2023, we've seen over this time period in each one of those time jumps that I'm showing you there on the chart. Most of these are 5-year time jumps. You're seeing growth, a bigger dark blue bar. You're seeing growth in those dispatchable or baseload sources of energy. And since 2020, we've seen, or since the late 2010s, 2017, 2018, we've seen a very rapid growth in Florida's solar power capacity, solar power generation. So in effect, Florida is following an energy augmentation model. California is following an energy transition model. And there are obviously very big differences. You know, electricity demand in Florida is increasing. The economy is growing fast. The population is growing. However, it's not, and California is a little bit more stagnant, lately especially, but has grown over the longer term. But neither state, of course, can compare to China in terms of economic growth or population growth over time or energy consumption growth over time. They obviously are growing at a much faster pace. The economy particularly has grown from sort of a second-tier economy back in 1990 to one of the largest economies in the world, the second largest economy in the world today. But you can see that the Florida model is more like China's build now, break later, or build now, destroy later, because they're building both traditional fossil fuel energy sources, nuclear, etc., right? And they are building renewables together. And maybe in future, once the model settles down, once they do the grid improvements that are needed to integrate intermittent sources of renewable energy generation, maybe then, a state like Florida could consider reducing or cutting down on its capacity of traditional fossil fuel energy sources. But that's not what's happening right now. So which model is better? Well, that's a little bit subjective, and I know I'm treading on a much more subjective, you might even say a little bit more of a political third rail, if you will, in this portion of the video. But I would say that the augmentation model, the energy augmentation model, the build now, destroy later, or break later model is winning globally. Because the countries, the states that have tried to go for more of a true energy transition have tended to see very large increases in their energy costs and their electricity costs relative to the energy augmentation countries and states. So on this next slide, and I know this is a little bit hard to read, this actually did take some time to put together. The data comes from various sources. From late 2024 to early this year. But what I've done is I've taken a bunch of different countries and states. I've translated their residential and their industrial or commercial energy costs, electricity costs, into dollars per kilowatt hours, so that you can kind of compare what energy costs are like, electricity costs anyway, are like in a lot of these different places around the world. And The left-hand arrow you see there is Florida, okay? And just to the left of Florida is actually China, okay? So you can see that Florida and China have some of the lowest residential and industrial commercial energy costs of any of the places, countries, and states that I've placed on this chart in the world. The right-hand arrow, dark, black, thick arrow, points to the state of California. And you can see that California actually has very high energy costs, both compared to the US average, which is the fourth set of bars on the left-hand side of this chart, as well as even compared to some countries in Europe, for example, Spain. Now, I will tell you, there are different things going on here than just energy strategy. Obviously, there are differences in states' energy consumption, right? For example, California is the average person's bill is going to be affected by the fact that they tend to use less energy, less electricity, because as you might have heard, it gets pretty hot here in Florida in the summer months, and we're all running our AC most of the time. In California, the weather's a lot milder in many places, so there's less need for that. I'm not saying there's no need for that. I've spent considerable time in California, and it's been really hot there sometimes I've been there. But generally speaking, California has easier weather from an electricity standpoint than the state of Florida or a state like Texas. And of course, you have things like in China, you'll notice that the industrial commercial bar is much taller than the residential bar. And that is because China has a policy of subsidizing residential power prices versus, and basically who pays for that are companies, industrial commercial. So that accounts for that. Most countries, as you can see on my chart, the residential power price is much higher than the commercial and industrial price. Also, in a country like Spain, which has definitely followed more of that energy transition model, I could certainly talk about that in a future video. You've seen things like what they call the Iberian exception, where the European Union allowed Spain to cap its natural gas price for a period of time, which pushed down the cost of power in Spain, but it actually did impact negatively the cost of power in neighboring countries like France, for example. And I can get into some of these regional issues as well, but you can see there the countries that have followed more, countries and states that have followed more of the transition model, such as Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Massachusetts on the far right-hand side of my chart, California, New York, they tend to have much higher electricity prices, both residential and industrial commercial, than the countries and states that have followed more of an energy augmentation or build now, break later policy like Florida, Texas, and China. So I hope that helps illustrate what I was talking about in that last video, why I think that the term energy transition or green energy transition is a misnomer. Countries that have followed that model purely have seen some pretty nasty economic side effects. It's hurt manufacturing activity in Germany a lot, for example. Denmark has had disputes with Sweden because its wind power is so variable, it has to import a lot of electricity from neighboring Sweden at times, to the point that this actually became an election issue, which caused the election of, which was a major issue in the recent Swedish elections. The new government, more of a center-right type government, made it one of their major campaign issues to reduce the volatility of power prices in Sweden caused by Denmark's very volatile energy generation from wind and the corresponding impact on electricity prices in Sweden, which gets most of its power from nuclear and hydro particularly. So I hope that helps explain some of what's going on, why I think the energy transition model is a misnomer, why I think it's more of an energy augmentation, at least in places that have been successful with it, like China, like Florida, like Texas. So I hope that helps explain all of that. And if you are interested in this service in more depth, our model portfolios, we do cover issues like this in the service. I'd encourage you to check out the trial offer we have, which I'll post below this video, for the service. So with that, thanks again for listening. My name's Elliot Gu. I'm co-founder and publisher of Energy and Income Advisor and Free Market Speculator.